Right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natasha Hennessy. I am a research assistant with the Climate Action Beacon, and I'm here today to welcome you all to the next lunchtime webinar in our Climate Action series. This one is called Prospects for a National Climate Beacon Centre. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm joining you from today, the lands of the Ugambe Nation and the Kumameri people. I am forever honoured to learn about this place and hear stories about my home, how it's changed, the ecosystems and traditions from those who have continuously cared for this land for many tens of thousands of years. I pay my respects to elders past and present and invite you to do the same for wherever you are standing. I will introduce the speakers to you as we progress through today, but our session will consist of a presentation by the wonderful Professor Prof Mackey, the Director of the Climate Action Beacon, which will be followed by a panel discussion with Dr. Esther Onyengo from CSIRO and Brendan Peterson, who's the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development. We'll then have a Q&A session, so please feel free as we go through today to put your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box if that's available to you, and we'll read them out when we get there. We hope you enjoy today's session. And Brendan, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thanks, Natasha, and to Andrew and Esther for joining us today, and for our participants for taking the time to come and listen to our presentation and discussion. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which I'm speaking to you from, like Natasha, it's the Gold Coast, Kumameri peoples, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So we're here today to talk about the National Climate Beacon Centre, which is a proposal for identifying priorities and directing research effort and funding at the intersection of the net zero transition and climate adaptation. This proposal is being co-developed by Griffith University and our wonderful colleagues at CSIRO. If you want more information after this presentation, which I hope you all will, please contact myself or Michael Battaglia, who's leading the CSIRO team on this initiative. Well, anyone who's been reading the news the last few weeks has seen we're starting to see a little bit of a pushback about climate action. That top green box on the left is from Tony Blair's website, the Tony Blair Foundation, where he seems to have been taking or having a very close relationship these days with Middle Eastern oil corporations, and is actually arguing that perhaps we need to be rethinking the urgency of our transition away from fossil fuels. In the middle there's an article, a commentary piece in the New York Times, where there's some financial institutions who are reconsidering their net zero commitments. And that's a snapshot from the President Trump's White House policy priorities in the energy sector, which at the bottom says he's going to be withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. Well, that all may well be happening, but the reality, if you like, the climate reality is quite different, because we still have a climate crisis and a growing one. Emissions continue to increase. The current mitigation policy puts us on track for 3 degrees above global warming above pre-industrial levels by 2100. And there's a lot of science now saying that we've already hit the 1.5 degree threshold. That's global fossil fuel CO2 emissions, time on the bottom axis, a billion tonnes of carbon on the vertical axis. And you can see that we're still tracking what looks very much like a straight line in terms of increasing emissions. The result is that current policies there will, if current policies continue and the associated emissions continue at the current rate, we are on track to hit around 3.1 degrees in 2100. Under the Paris Agreement, there are nationally determined contributions. There's two sorts there, unconditional and conditional. That depends upon the conditional are those where developing countries are dependent upon supporting funding from wealthy countries. But even the conditional NDCs are still well over 2 degrees. Why is this important? Well, that just shows you that we have a very serious mitigation challenge. Again, we've got time on the bottom axis, and this time it's gigatons of CO2 on the vertical axis, and they show you how global CO2 equivalent emissions have to contract in the coming decades if we're to limit global warming to 1.5 range, a 2 degree range, or even below 3 degrees. And the bars on the right show the emission gap, i.e. the gap between what's needed to limit warming and what's actually happening. So the need for rapid and deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions increases with every year. Why is that important? Well, it's because every increment of global warming, we have an increase in climate trends, rising sea levels, warming, changing rainfall seasonality, and extreme weather events, which we experience as wildfires, droughts, storms, cyclones, heavy rainfall, and flooding. Every increment of global warming above 1.5 degrees leads to increased likelihood of irreversible loss and damage, such as tropical forest bleaching, loss of ice, etc. So the 1.5 degree threshold is not arbitrary, it's science-based, and we have a growing mitigation gap, but also a growing adaptation gap, that being the gap between the increasing impacts and risks and the investments needed to recognise and manage those risks. So we really face what we think of, are thinking of in terms of the mitigation adaptation nexus, which means we have to do two things in parallel. We have to achieve and work towards net zero emissions, and we have to better understand and manage our climate risks. And we need to do both of these in parallel together, achieve net zero emissions and manage climate risks in order to support a climate resilient Australia. And of course, we always have to consider our regional context and the resilience not only of Australian society and economy and environment, but also that of our regional neighbours. So we need to be ending emissions from fossil fuel and deforestation degradation, plus at the same time adapting to escalating climate impacts and risks. We need to do both together in a coordinated way at scale that will enable synergies and avoid perverse outcomes. And we're referring to this as integrated climate action that will deliver a resilient Australia and indeed regional and world community. We need to be accelerating the transition from fossil fuels to clean renewable energy sources, while at the same time adapting to escalating climate risks of increasing complexity, which is to say we need to be fixing the problems faster than we're creating them. So there's a number of challenges that we face. And because these mitigation adaptation gaps are growing, we need new knowledge, tools, approaches, and decision support. So we've got kind of three factors there that we think are part of the challenge. How we address these challenges has importance for the resilience of our systems, the resilience of our communities and regional and national economies. Our responses also influence the resilience of our ecosystems and the resilience of what academically we refer to as our socio-ecological systems, the many ways in which Australia's social and economic well-being and vitality is connected to and dependent upon healthy ecosystems and the services and benefits they provide. A key aspect of our mitigation and adaptation actions is who carries the costs and who benefits. So these are fundamental considerations of distributive justice and social equity. We need climate action investment and actions that reduce social vulnerabilities and social exposures to climate risks. So integrated climate action is needed to follow those pathways and opportunities that avoid unintended consequences, promote synergies and build socio-ecological resilience. We also know that place matters. A lot of the upside opportunities for mitigation and clean energy and many social risks and vulnerabilities which need to be addressed through adaptation come together in place. Local and regional places differ in their natural assets, social capital, infrastructure, historic legacies, environmental conditions, emission profiles, climate risks, and opportunities for climate action. However, we currently have limited capacity to progress these place-based opportunities. So we need to be identifying knowledge gaps, feasible options and strategies, design decision support tools, and be building capacity to unlock place-based integrated climate action. So how will these challenges be addressed? The last one there is about information, because we know it's diffuse and rapidly updated. We know that much relevant information exists, but it's not necessarily accessible to those who need it. Professional groups are looking for guidance on risks and standards. Community groups are looking for information of how change will impact the things they value and be done. And businesses need cost-effective solutions. Not always easy to obtain trusted and comprehensive information. So how can a National Climate Beacon Centre contribute to addressing these challenges? Well, we need to be building strong networks between government, communities and the academy and industries to mobilise legitimised information, accelerate coordinated actions, identify gaps and prioritize activities. The National Climate Beacon Centre could help convene these networks across community, policy, industry and R&D sector to prioritise action, direct investments and build action groups in emerging issues such as housing and infrastructure that lie at the intersection of these challenges. We need to be mobilising information and anticipatory modelling to support collective action and ensuring that these actions are not vulnerable to maladaptive choices. And we need to be using these convened networks of community, businesses and government who are best placed to identify the gaps and the needs to advance all of this. How we address resilience is obviously important. We need to strengthen capacity for processes to support equitable action and build processes and capabilities for incorporation of climate risk in decision-making and planning. The National Climate Beacon Centre can support community action, financial investments for resilient action and insurability, and employ communications and innovative use of data to ensure that socio-economic vulnerabilities are well understood and are factored into transition planning and policy. To advance place-based approaches, we need to be fostering collaboration and supporting inclusive local leadership to tackle problems, capture opportunities, and use value chain decarbonisation to unlock place-based opportunities. A National Climate Beacon Centre could help direct resources and conduct place-based regional experiments to pilot approaches and build evidence for action and work with tiers of government to establish community-sensitive planning, recovery and relocation processes. We can be co-designing place-based approaches which enable a broad range of stakeholders to identify pathways and actions that secure their futures. We could be analysing trends and risks, including socio-economic vulnerabilities, which can inform industry standards, actions and transition policy and planning. Coming from university, we also see a major role in terms of addressing the challenge of diffuse and rapidly changing information. We need to make sure that sectors and stakeholders have the capacity and capability to access the necessary tools and trusted sources of information needed for navigating new regulatory environments and for understanding and responding to rapidly changing risk environments. The National Climate Beacon Centre could help build trusted and reliable information and tools to support a capability services sector to assist transition needs. including connecting with locally led training programs, e.g. Indigenous land management. Facilitate knowledge sharing to support strategic planning and implementation using co-design participatory approaches that consider the needs of vulnerable groups, and to collaborate with learning institutions to embed climate literacy into university curricula as a core unit, including short courses to support literacy, capability, and capacity building. So what would a National Climate Beacon Centre look like? Well, this diagram attempts to illustrate that. So what we're calling a National Climate Beacon Centre, it would really function as a national hub for identifying and directing funding, coordinating and advancing collaborative climate action research, sharing best practices and policies, and building the collective capability and capacity across governments, sectors and society to support climate transition planning and implementation through research and practice-based learning and application. I think it would be more accurately described from an organisational structural point of view as a core node in a network of interconnected nodes and networks, which in organisational theory is referred to as a net-centric approach. We're not talking about having a centre in a single building where huge amounts of resources are poured into and it does all the work. Not at all. We're talking about an enabling hub. It would focus on three key areas or pillars: discourse and discovery. And these relate to the previous two slides where we're talking about challenges and what the centre could do. Discourse and discovery, which is about coordinated and forward-looking research and engagement processes, identifying those. Piloting and activating pathways to climate action, place-based case studies where integrated climate action strategies and options can be piloted and validated, and mobilising climate action knowledge, a learning hub to identify, translate and implement climate action knowledge. And our proposition is that a national program of interconnected climate action organised around these three pillars will help deliver a better connected, coordinated and informed innovation system, building Australia's capacity and capability towards climate adaptation and mitigation, enabling resilience, with this vision of that all these endeavours are intended to contribute to the vision of an Australia, and I would argue, and region where the risks and opportunities of a low carbon future are understood. Communities and industries and organisations are equipped to take necessary integrated climate action, and all sectors have the capacity to adapt and advance just and inclusive outcomes. Taking a net-centric approach, key to this initiative would be the inputs and guidance of industry and community and government and research institutions who are best placed to identify the gaps and needs, and also in terms of the implementation network, R&D providers, industry, government, community service providers and other emerging networks. So the idea is there'd be resources coming in and being distributed to those three core areas through an implementation network. What I want to do to finish up is just give two use cases of the kinds of problems that this centre could be helping Australia deal with. The first one, before I do that, I want to say we actually have a proven example of this kind of net-centric approach with respect to climate action. Some or many or all of you may remember the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. It was a unique venture established by the Australian government to harness and coordinate the capability of Australia's researchers to generate and communicate knowledge that decision makers needed for successful adaptation to climate change. It saw communication, consultation and network building as critical and worked together to bring a community of practice to build a robust and resilient Australia. And as a result of NCAF's work, Australia became really ahead of the pack globally in terms of understanding risks and adaptation strategies and how that connected to planning. Of course, with this integrated climate action, we're dealing with not just adaptation, but also the mitigation and how we need both of these for resilience. But that is an example of a federally funded net-centric model, which I think is very successful. So here's our first use case study, climate resilient and low carbon housing. The problem is, I'm sure many of you are aware, Australia's housing policies are fragmented. Current responses do not consider from a climatic point of view, do not consider long-term needs or impacts and risks of climate change on housing. There is undersupply of dwellings, underinvestment in social and affordable housing, and barriers to home ownership. Proposed new housing developments are relying on industries experiencing skill shortages, instability and affordability issues. Solutions for climate resilient and low carbon housing, the kinds of interventions are appropriate and considered building codes that consider a range of environmental conditions, retrofitting of existing homes and redesign of suitable dwellings, public-private partnerships to supply suitable housing, broadening of the housing policy focus from urban and suburban to regional and remote, coherent housing policies that consider long-term needs and climate resilience, and responding to skills and workforce shortages in regional and remote areas. NCBC's role, the Centre's role in driving climate capability here, would be to help address the fragmentation in knowledge, action and policy by coordinating action among research, industry and community, informed by the community's emerging needs, including both private and public sector practitioners, by doing a number of interventions and activities, leading dialogue, discussion and outcomes, and integrating climate considerations into housing standards and policies, convening of round tables with an evidence base, bringing together major planners, including community voices, to identify what needs to be done, catalysing public, private and community partnerships to pilot and deliver resilient infrastructure and housing, providing innovative spaces and evidence analysis and tools for climate futures pathway planning, supporting and evaluating place and system-based responses, brokering the necessary expertise, and identifying, presenting positive policy options and activating place-based pathways. A second case use is this issue of climate, energy, infrastructure and land-based mitigation. The problem is that mitigation requires clean energy and it also requires removal, with land doing much of heavy lifting for both. Clean energy infrastructure needs to be rolled out fast and at scale across landscapes, and natural ecosystems and plantings are the only mechanism we have for removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Plus, we have all the other demands that we have on land: growing food, delivering clean water, nature repair market for biodiversity, critical minerals, coal seam gas, and other fossil fuel mining continues. The solutions hinge around issues to do with social license, environmental protection, policy that supports cross-jurisdictional coordination, land use planning and zoning, and integration of all of this into regional economic development. The Centre's role in driving climate capability here, all those things we talked about in the first use case, plus decision support for spatial planning, harmonising policy regimes, proof of concept, place-based pilots, and community-centred planning approaches. There's another use case study about micro-credentials and job skilling. We'll be sharing this PowerPoint, and I'd encourage everyone to look at that use case as well. But in the interest of time, I need to finish up. So what would it take to bring this proposal for life? Well, we need a core body of people and organisations willing to help take this to the next phase. We have an alliance of national peak organisations who are providing advice and guidance. We'd like to shape this more and need to shape this more with government and with other industry sectors. A block of core funding is needed to provide the coordination, governance and to house the knowledge infrastructure. Some resources are needed to take this now to a broader body of partners to build alliances across the whole innovation system, including our colleagues in other universities, and develop a more detailed prospectus. And place-based and challenge fund activity or funds are needed, so we can start to target prioritise areas, developed in concert with what we would want to form as a reference committee brought together from government, industry and community. Perhaps a kind of CRC scale of funding for that part of it. We do have a whole theory of change. I don't have time to go through this. As I said, we'll be sharing the PowerPoint. This document will be there. I want to thank Michael and Esther and other CSIRO colleagues who took us through this very, I think, useful theory of change framework that they have. But, you know, there's a whole program logic here behind what we're talking about. Oh, this is my last slide. I just saw this in the news yesterday. The world's largest all-electric ferry has just been launched in Tasmania. Innovation in Australia when it comes to climate action is certainly possible and needed. So thank you very much, and I'll end my presentation there and hand back to Natasha and our panel.
Thanks, Brendan. All right, so don't forget, if you have any questions, to start putting them in the chat box, because we'll get to those shortly. We're going to have a bit of a discussion now with our two guest speakers. So if I can ask you, Esther and Andrew, to please turn on your cameras. Okay, I'd like to introduce everybody to Dr. Esther Onyango, who's an interdisciplinary systems scientist with an interest in connections between human and environmental health. Her work takes a planetary health approach to determine drivers of human health risks in linked socio-ecological systems in the context of global stresses like climate change. She draws on extensive career experience spanning industry, academia, policy, private sector, and intergovernmental organisations in both developed and developing countries, focusing on sustainable transitions that protect human and ecosystem health. Her current role at CSIRO is a research lead for healthy and sustainable transitions in agri-food systems. Joining her is Andrew Peterson, who's been the Chief Executive Officer, Director and Company Secretary of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia since March 2011. Before taking on this role, Andrew had a 25-plus year legal and policy career as a legal advisor on matters relating to environmental risk, law and policy, and climate change. He's also a thought leader and advisor for the business of sustainability in Australia and overseas. We're thrilled to have you both here to discuss the possibilities of a National Climate Beacon Centre. We just have a few questions for you. Esther, I might start with you. A broad one. What do you think the National Climate Beacon Centre, why do you think the National Climate Beacon Centre is a good idea?
Thanks for that question, Natasha. And I think Brendan, just to start, has illustrated really well why we need the National Climate Action Beacon Centre. And I think it's not just a good idea, it's essential. As we've seen from the presentation, Australia faces the challenge of reducing emissions, but at the same time, developing like many other nations as well. At the moment, we have fragmented responses to climate change. We have strong pockets of innovation, but no national platform to align efforts to scale what works and to ensure that no community is left behind. And although we have seen incredible momentum at local and state levels, for example, in Melbourne, there's the urban forest strategy. And in South Australia, we can see early leadership on renewables. And these are world-class examples of climate action. But without that national coordination, we risk having a patchwork of efforts that don't add up to the scale of change we need. Hence why we need the National Climate Beacon Centre, which offers a solution. And as Brendan illustrated, it's designed to act as a network of networks, connecting science, policy, and practice across sectors and regions, and turning the climate ambition that we have into visible and coordinated action that brings together the best science, policy, and community-led solutions as well. So I think designed really well, the National Climate Beacon Centre could play a crucial role in linking climate action also with everyday concerns. For example, like heat, which is a growing concern, health, housing, and livability, which will be increasingly also becoming important in the context of the extreme and severe climate impacts that we are seeing and are projected to keep happening. And we also have examples of where this has worked really well. So the example with NCAF, of course, nationally, and internationally, we've seen the EU has implemented a climate neutral and smart cities mission which is bringing together 100 cities to act as pilots for decarbonisation and climate resilience. So these cities are coming together not just to reduce emission, but also to improve climate resilience in terms of health, equity, and livability at the same time. So examples like this provide a really good platform and the kind of integrated and inspiring model that the National Climate Beacon could be for Australia as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Do you want to explain a little bit about what CSIRO is already doing that would kind of contribute to this program of work?
I think CSIRO has been deeply committed towards reducing emissions and also increasing climate resilience. And I think a really key public example of this is the Towards Net Zero initiative, which was launched in October 2022, which is seeing great success already. The aim of the Net Zero mission was to provide Australian industry, agriculture, and regional communities with the tools to achieve zero emissions, but also realize opportunities of transitioning to a low carbon economy. And this program is also already generating a lot of impact nationally. We're seeing the industry aligning with global markets. There is world-class monitoring, and there's trust underpinning new industry. There's generation of cost-effective, low and negative emissions processes to ensure that these transitions to net zero are profitable and also a good business model. And there's also sustainable growth opportunities for the regions, for the communities and businesses. And this mission really embeds the governance principles that the National Climate Beacon Centre is built on. These principles of collaboration here through capacity building, science, tech, and innovation. There's already collaborative networks through the industrial regions networks, which builds on national understanding of different net zero transitions and what they look like in different regions. And within that, there is the embedding of the Indigenous and community leadership. So really focusing on inclusive and place-based actions. So it's a good example of a program that generates that type of networks that we're looking for, embeds Indigenous knowledge and community engagement. It's inclusive, it's place-based, and it's not just a top-down program. It's also bottom-up and a catalyst for coordinated and locally relevant just climate transitions.
Amazing, thank you. All right, Angela, we have a few questions for you as well. What do you see as the role of business in bringing together mitigation and adaptation?
Thanks for the question. And just for the benefit, I guess, of the audience, a little bit about BCSD Australia, which is a co-founding member of the Alliance of Peaks and has been delighted to be part of that conversation now for quite some time. It's great to see it now manifesting in this thing that I'm going to call from now on the NCBC, because it's very long-winded to say the National Climate Beacon Centre. And I say that as an organisation whose name is the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. So a bit about BCSD. We're part of a global network of 67 other organisations that are part of a hub and spoke model called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And our role is to sit at the intersection of environmental and social sciences, corporate strategy and policy work, and support organisations, including the corporate sector, where they want to meet and align with and create an ambition with accountability to drive action. So what's fascinating from my perspective is that work is then released into the Creative Commons to share with business and policymakers more broadly. And so that's why we were immediately attracted to the work that Brendan and the team were doing on the CRA 2030, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But then now seeing that work morph into the NCBC, I think is a really critical and let's be frank, opportunistic moment in time because of the sliding doors moment which occurred on Saturday as a result of the federal election, that these matters are of immense importance to the private sector. And with that, the private sector is, I think, where policy meets reality. And what I mean by that is that policy is both the implementer and has been largely the innovator in integrated climate action in the absence of robust, long-term and and significant signals from policy makers around what is the strategic intent of frameworks to create decarbonisation pathways. That is changing. When it comes to the issue of mitigation and adaptation, I think we're all agreed that they're not two separate lanes anymore. And certainly for business, they're in fact the same road. And so through our members, whether they are global or here in Australia, whether they're in the finance sector, in infrastructure, agribusiness, or even heavy industry, we're seeing firsthand that decarbonisation has to go hand in hand with resilience planning because it's logical, it makes great business sense, and it reveals inherent flaws in a business model as a result of the introduction of climate risk into your strategic intent, and now as reporting requirements demand, investor interest in how you're going to treat this from a capital forward perspective. So I think I look at it from the perspective that if you're not looking at it, if you're not going to address it, you're otherwise in this situation of building a plane while flying through turbulence. You want to address the turbulence and move to another pathway, but plus building the plane at the same time. So the NCBC for us at BCSD Australia is an opportunity, I think, to hardwire the reality of this reality that I've just mentioned into national policy, research, and importantly, funding strategies that will bring business to the table earlier, not as an afterthought. So with that, I think that it's precisely where industry leadership through organisations like ours and others that are part of the Alliance, but hopefully others as well, will come into and be part of the pivotal work that the NCBC wishes to undertake. I think at the end of the day, it's why the business community really can't be just part of the downstream recipient of policy. It actually has to be at the design table, and that's exactly what the NCBC is going to be about.
Awesome. So if we expand on that maybe a little bit, can you explain how you think this program would build on the work of the Climate Ready Australia 2030?
So there's a couple of aspects to that, and the way I look at it is, in my own simple way, that the CRA 2030, see, we're doing TLAs like you wouldn't believe, but the CRA was work that gave us the blueprint. Now the NCBC is going to give us the chance to build the structure as a result of what the blueprint told us. And what I mean by that is that the CRA really did lean into and provide some important intellectual and collaborative groundwork as to what was needed, and importantly, asked the Alliance of Peaks. Not just us, there was a number of other organisations, Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand, I think the Australian Landscape Architects. There were some really interesting and diverse inputs and views that were provided into that first tranche of work. I think it convened the right people for the moment, and it really did map the knowledge gaps, and I think at the end of the day underscored the urgency, hence the discussion we're now having around the NCBC. Where the NCBC takes us further in its next phase, I think, is threefold. The first is going to be identifying the priorities to implement solutions. Brendan talked about the reality, I think, of going from now consultation to co-investment, and that doesn't necessarily mean funds. It means design intent about how you build something together. And the third is taking a strategy and turning it into capacity building for business, because there's still a lot of work to be done in a lot of sectors in Australia in relation to decarbonisation. But also we have to do a lot of work in capacity building inside government itself, because it's built for a historical energy system. It needs to rebuild for a new energy system. So I think that's going to be important, because it also has to communicate to a community what that's going to mean and what role they play. So with that, I think the opportunity now is actually to create a national climate innovation ecosystem, which NCBC is going to be, that is importantly business literate, community-led, and Brendan talked about the role of Indigenous communities, and that's an important element to it. but just as importantly, globally credible, because we will be looked on, particularly if we host COP31, around what are we doing, how are we doing it, and what others can learn from that. And with that, I think it's true to say, and I speak on behalf of the members, that BCSD is very, very much ready to help shape that ecosystem.
Awesome. You touched a little bit on capacity building. How do you think the NCBC could support business needs? What do you think that they are for this transition?
Yeah, and Esther actually referred to this in her presentation, I think, and the way I understand it, and I try to explain it to the members, poorly, I suspect, but hopefully effectively, is that what actually business now needs is not just more information. There's an awful lot out there. What it needs is actionable intelligence. And with that, you need tools to do a number of things. Whether that's, and Brendan actually highlighted these, and I'll just paraphrase them, assess physical and transition risk across supply chain, which is incredibly important in business because, and this is an interesting observation around Australian business, our supply chain is the reverse of the Northern Hemisphere. Ours is very much out into Asia. Europeans are ostensibly European, American, and in some cases Asia. Now increasingly they're starting to look at what Asia does. Well, we've got a lot to tell them about how that would work, but we've got a lot to learn first about how we need to build the response around physical and transition risk. As an island nation, that comes with its own interesting challenges. The second is, and I don't think we've talked about this yet terribly much, but it's going to become a big issue for business in Australia in this new geopolitical environment, and that is how we understand the regulatory environments that exist out there, whether that's the ISSB reporting alignment, aligned reporting frameworks that exist, the new interface between climate and nature, and TNFD and its reporting framework, and then this thing called CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism with the Europeans have introduced, that has either a brake on the ability of business to trade and invest with Europe, but if we get this right and the NCBC plays its role, I think it has an opportunity to create that the breakdown of that barrier so that business in fact benefits from engagement with European companies and policymakers in relation to decarbonisation. The other that I'm glad he mentioned it was training leadership teams and workforce for a climate-ready economy. We heard a lot about this in the last term of the last government. It'll be hopeful and helpful that if that's brought back, because I'm not so sure that we're skills ready. And with that, we have to, in business, understand what we need from academia, what we need from tertiary institutions, what we need from vocational training to be able to do this, not just in absentia, but actually very quickly. And that's not necessarily something I think that we've yet built into our thinking and, more importantly, our investing in business just yet. So with that, we like to think that our role at BCSD is going to be to help to connect business with the needs they have to NCBC's knowledge sharing pillar. That's going to be really important. And if it's designed well, I don't think we're going to be talking about NCBC just in the terms of creating transitional pathways. It's going to be talking about helping building them with industry at the wheel.
Do you have any final thoughts on how the private sector should be engaging for more coherent climate policy and planning?
Oh, where does one begin on that question? It's a really interesting question because I think that business, to a certain extent, is fairly shell-shocked after the last 10, 15 years, if not 20 years. Global financial crisis of 2008, you've had obviously pandemic of 2020 through to 2022. We have now the impact of decisions that are being made by the US administration in relation to the historical apparatus of free and fair trade across the world. And with that, business is going, oh, what do I do? Again, how does this work? So it is true to say that for a large part, and what I mean by that is, if we look at the 80-20 rule here, it's very true that 20% of most business across the world has been very active in taking those initial steps, what's historically called the bleeding edge, but I now think is the fast followers in relation to climate action. It's probably true to say, though, that it's the 80% that this NCBC is needing to target. It has to help them move from reactive engagement to co-designing policy and practice as quickly as possible. And again, that's not something historically Australian business has involved itself in. It historically waits for government to tell it if it's doing the right thing or the wrong thing, and then it marks it down by telling it has to have regulation attached to it, or it tries to create a form of incentive through subsidies or credits or tax breaks in relation to incentivising. I think we need to find a new and third way that does that in a more coherent way. And with that, NCBC, I think, as it's being designed, is going to show how true cross-sector collaboration could actually look, and could be the sort of the architectural apparatus about where that happens. So my big encouragement to those in business and business associations and industry associations is get involved. Get involved now. Don't wait for this to be announced at some point in COP31 that it's happening. Get involved now. Be part of the design process. Be part of the enthusiasm and the opportunity that something like this is going to help your constituency build better, faster. And so be involved in the pilot projects, bring forward your case studies. Esther and both Brendan also gave some important case studies. They are just the tip of the iceberg of what I consider to be the innovative productivity that business in Australia has actually done that nobody talks about. And we need to talk about it, learn lessons from, and pivot quickly. And finally, champion the transition. Don't be unwilling to acknowledge that we are going through something. Actually come forward and say, we know it's hard, but we know it's going to be vital for the future of our business model and, more importantly, the economic model of Australia. And with that, what is the role of Indigenous knowledge? That's going to be something we've articulated back to the proposal process that needs to be involved in the design of this particular project. They are all business resilience issues. So it's very exciting times, and I'm very enthused by what Brendan and the team have brought forward, and we're very eager to continue to be part of what's hopefully going to be, I think, one of the really seminal moments in Australian development, which is scalable and implementable and very much responsive to business realities going forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Brendan or Esther, do you have any responses? Anything else you want to add?
Yes, well, thanks, Andrew and Esther, for those comments and contributions. And Andrew, I completely agree that and that was kind of why I put up that slide of the world's first largest fully electric ferry. I mean, it was built in Tasmania. And it's a world's first, and we completely ignore at our peril the kind of capacity for innovation in the Australian private sector, and how much we need that for this integrated climate action we're talking about. And I also would just reflect upon what Esther was saying. CSIRO really has put its shoulder to the wheel here, I think, in again trying to take these kind of integrated innovative approaches forward. It's a huge shift. I started my research career working in the CSIRO division of land use research, as it was then called. And so CSIRO at its best is always pushing the envelope. So it's really pleasing to see CSIRO, Esther and her colleagues, and Michael, what they're doing in this space. One of the challenges for us is to build an initiative like this, speaking as someone in the university sector. And NCAF, one of the other lessons from NCAF was it did involve a network of universities. It wasn't one university. it was hosted, the hub was hosted at Griffith University, but it was a network of universities, and the resources were distributed through universities. And that, again, that's something that we need. We need our 30-odd universities to be working collaboratively towards a shared national research agenda for integrated climate action. And my hope is the NCBC can help bring that about.
Awesome. Thanks, Brendan. I don't see any question. There's one question in the chat box, Brendan, that I might put to you. It's a question about
the slide, a fuller list, on the information pack. So we have what we call a concept. We're calling it a concept note. It's quite a large document. It's currently, we have a draft is currently being formatted by a graphic designer, and we're very happy to distribute that to everybody, shortly. It contains a lot more detail about what we've talked about, some more information about the case studies, and also about the initiative that Andrew talked about that we have been working on with the Alliance of Peaks, the Climate Ready 2030, and some of the material that produced. But that's what we mean by the information pack, and it will be ready for public circulation shortly. Awesome.
Thanks, Brendan. If there aren't any other questions, I might just pose one final one to you, Brendan. How has this proposal been socialised, or have you had any discussions with the Australian government about it?
Well, yes, we have. Before the election, Griffith and CSIRO gave a joint presentation to federal government agencies. This was organised through the Federal Department of Environment, Water, Energy and Climate Change. I think I got that right. There was quite a large number, about the same number that we have on this webinar, from across all agencies and departments. It was very encouraging to see that. The problem we identified was well accepted and acknowledged, and we had very positive feedback from a number of players from different agencies who we agreed to have some more follow-up dialogue and discussions post-election. And obviously, depending upon how the election turned out, and that has turned out in a way where that doors will be open for that dialogue. I also chaired or emceed a summit that was held in Canberra before the election. It was called Climate Disclosures and Risks in the Public Sector, where there were representatives from federal and state agencies working on climate risks and disclosures, how these relate to enterprise risks and also issues to do with adaptation planning. And again, I was able to discuss the proposal with a wide range of people there. And again, the time seems to have arrived where people are seeing that we need to be bringing these dimensions of climate action together in an integrated way, and paying a lot more attention to the differences throughout regional Australia in terms of how these issues play out and where the opportunities are.
Awesome. All right, well, we're nearly at time. And if there aren't any further questions, then we might just wrap up. I'd like to thank you, Andrew and Esther and Brendan, for your presentations and your discussion today. As Brendan mentioned at the start, if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the Climate Action Beacon team. And the recording of this webinar will be up on the website in coming days.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.